Darwin was impressed by the expressive faces of primates and saw parallels with humans in the grinning and laughing faces that they frequently make. Young orangutans, when tickled, likewise grin and make a chuckling sound. Having observed similar facial gestures in humans and primates under broadly similar circumstances, Darwin suggested that a number of these gestures may have arisen from a common primate ancestor. Observational work by ethologists Richard Andrew and J. Van Hoof have helped to flesh out this original suggestion. Andrew sees primate facial expressions as a secondary consequence of the vocalizations they produce when in an emotional state. The shrill shriek that monkeys make in fearful circumstances, for example, requires pulling back the lips into a fear grin. Andrew argues that having originally evolved in order to allow the relevant sound to be made, such a facial gesture may now be used silently. Van Hoof likewise has observed and documented homologous expressions in humans and other primates. He sees two dimensions in prosocial gestures: friendliness, which involves a non-threatening baring of the teeth, and playfulness, which involves an open mouth and staccato vocalization. In human terms, friendliness involves smiling, and playfulness involves laughing. According to Van Hoof, the silent bared teeth display originated as an appeasing signal and later evolved into a friendly gesture. An open-mouth vocal gesture, however, may be used as an invitation to play, and all primates have been found to engage in playful activity. Van Hoof's scheme for the evolutionary development of laughter and smiling is shown on the left. On the right side of the schematic, we see the development of laughter. In the center, smiling, and on the left, anger. The amygdala is an almond-shaped bundle of neurons found in each cerebral hemisphere about an inch from each of your ears. It is an important part of the limbic system, a group of components which lies deep within the brain and is concerned with emotions. We know that the limbic system and amygdala are involved in emotions since humans and animals with damage to this area show inappropriate emotional responses. Humans with damage to the amygdala are unable to recognize fear in the faces of others. Brain scans of undamaged individuals have confirmed that the amygdala is active during the perception of emotional faces, and particularly when viewing fear. In addition to increased activation when viewing fear, PET scans also show an increased activation of the amygdala when perceiving sad but not angry faces. What these findings tell us about the nature of emotions is open to debate. Does the emotional state cause increased activity in the amygdala, or does increased activity in the amygdala cause the emotional state that we feel? The cortex of the brain consists of a 6 millimeter thick sheet of neurons, which forms the outer surface of the brain and covers the subcortex. The cortex is responsible for many of our higher functions, such as language processing, reasoning, and consciousness. Each part of the cortex is named after its position relative to the center of the brain. The orbital frontal cortex consists of the outer covering of the brain, just above the orbits of the eyes, hence the name. Just above the orbital frontal cortex are the frontal lobes, which consist of a large amount of cortex in each cerebral hemisphere that is involved in regulating behavior. The orbital frontal cortex receives information from the frontal lobes and the sensory systems. It also has extensive communication with a limbic system underneath it. In a sense, the orbital frontal cortex is kept informed about what is going on in the outside world and what is going on internally with regard to planned behavior. Furthermore, it is able to influence the activity of the limbic system and, in particular, the amygdala. It is not surprising, then, that the orbital frontal cortex is, in some way, involved in emotion. Damage to this area leads to profound changes in emotional response and to personality in general. One of the earliest documented cases of damage to the orbital frontal cortex occurred in the middle of the 19th century and involved railway foreman Phineas Gage. I tell you his steps in detail so you don't do this yourself at work. Phineas was working on the construction of a railroad when he came across a boulder lying in the way of the track. To remove this rock, he drilled a hole and filled it with dynamite. Then he rammed the dynamite down with a large tamping iron. A spark ignited the dynamite, and the explosion sent the iron bar through his cheek, straight through the front of his brain, and landing 300 feet away. Neuropsychologist Antonio Damasio and his co-workers used a computer to reconstruct the damage that occurred to the front of Phineas's brain, confirming that his orbital frontal cortex must have been largely obliterated. Amazingly, Phineas survived and was able to walk to a wagon and get a ride to the doctor. But after recovering, he was a changed man. Before the accident, he was seen as a serious and industrious man, but after the accident, he became irritable, childish, and thoughtless. This was perhaps the first clinical evidence that a specific portion of the cortex is heavily involved in emotion and personality. Other cases similar to Phineas Gage's have been reported, but the number is small because most people receiving such a serious injury would be unlikely to survive. In each of these cases, distinct changes in emotional responses have also been observed. The list of emotions affected is lengthy and includes anxiety, apathy, irritability, impulsivity, and a general lack of thought for others. Such a large list makes it unlikely that the orbital frontal cortex is specifically involved in one or two emotional states. It's more likely that this area of the brain is involved in integrating social and emotional cues in general to help construct an emotional response. These findings may be taken as evidence for the existence of an innate biological organization of emotional processing. Since brain organization is largely the outcome of selection pressures, evolutionary psychologists would argue that these findings support the notion that emotions are the product of evolution. In terms of structure, the left and right cerebral hemispheres of the forebrain are mirror images of each other, but in terms of function, they are quite different. This functional difference is known as lateralization. The study of lateralization began in the middle of the 19th century when it was observed that damage to the right hemisphere has little effect on language abilities, but damage to the left leads to profound linguistic deficits. The left hemisphere is especially associated with the recognition and processing of language, while the right plays a major role in emotions. One way of testing how well each hemisphere is able to recognize emotional expressions is by presenting visual representations of expressions to each hemisphere. This may sound quite complex, but it's actually an easy experiment to conduct. Primary visual input from each lateral field to the left or right of center is projected only to the visual processing centers of the opposite cerebral hemisphere. This means that visual input from the left visual field is initially sent only to the right hemisphere, and the right visual field only sent to the left hemisphere. By presenting pictures to either lateral visual field and recording a person's response, we can see how each hemisphere functions in isolation from the other. Fast measurement is required because, given enough time, the two hemispheres will pass information back and forth between them via a large bundle of neural fibers known as the corpus callosum. One way of using this half-visual field method is to present participants with a chimera image consisting of a neutral facial expression on one side and an emotional expression on the other side. When presented with a pair of chimeras, one with the emotion on the left and one with the emotion on the right, and asked which face shows the greatest emotional intensity, people tend to report that the one with the emotion on the left side is the most expressive. This suggests that the right hemisphere is indeed superior at recognizing expressed emotions. We might call this the right hemisphere hypothesis of emotional processing. But some researchers have suggested that while the right hemisphere is better able to recognize negative emotions, the left hemisphere is better at recognizing positive emotions. This notion is called the valence hypothesis. Workman et al. Have found there may be some truth in both hypotheses. When subjects are presented with 6 different chimeras for happiness, sadness, surprise, disgust, fear, and anger, the right hemisphere is better at recognizing antisocial expressions, and the left hemisphere is better with prosocial expressions. Workman suggests the fundamental difference between the two hemispheres in terms of emotional processing lies in a dichotomy between approaching versus withdrawing. The left hemisphere is associated with the urge to approach others, and the right hemisphere is associated with the urge to withdraw from social situations. Richard Davidson and his co-workers at the University of Wisconsin have suggested that although the right hemisphere is better at recognizing emotional stimuli, the left hemisphere may be more involved in actually experiencing emotion. Although the brain is very much the seat of human emotion, its activity is modified by hormones, which are secreted by endocrine glands throughout the body. The release of these hormones is ultimately controlled by the central nervous system, so there is a back and forth feedback loop between the brain and the hormones that influence it. An example of this dynamic is the activity of the hormone adrenaline, also known as epinephrine. When challenging emotional events occur, the amygdala sends messages to the autonomic nervous system, or ANS, which is the part of the nervous system which regulates the activity of the internal organs. The ANS, in turn, causes the release of adrenaline into the bloodstream from the adrenal glands just above the kidneys. This adrenaline is the fight or flight chemical which prepares target organs such as skeletal muscles for action. So, when frightened or excited, a part of the brain triggers the release of adrenaline, and this, in turn, prepares the body for the challenge. The question is, does the amygdala provide us with a feeling of anxiety, excitement, and general readiness for action, or does the adrenaline somehow cause these feelings? Once in the bloodstream, adrenaline, in addition to affecting the gut and the muscles, also travels to the brain, which triggered its release in the first place. In the brain, adrenaline has a number of effects, such as strengthening memory formation and influencing the amygdala. The amygdala sends neural fibers to higher centers in the cortex and receives feedback from these areas. So, the amygdala regulates the release of adrenaline, which comes back to regulate the activity of the amygdala. In addition to adrenaline, other hormones are released during emotional states. Testosterone and cortisol, for example, are both related to stressful events in life and to memory formation. Following a fight between two male mammals, the loser will show reduced levels of circulating testosterone and elevated levels of cortisol. Cortisol and other related hormones are believed to strengthen memory formation, suggesting that an animal which has been defeated is unlikely to forget who the victor is, or make the same mistake again. Evolutionists view this effect on memory formation as part of the function of emotions. The secretion of hormones not only prepares us physically for events, but also ensures that positive and negative encounters are remembered, since they are likely to have had survival and reproductive consequences for our ancestors. The notion of universal emotions is still controversial among social scientists. There are certainly cultural differences in facial expressions and emotional responses. We frequently hide our true emotions in public, and which emotions we hide or display, and to what extent, varies considerably between societies. In Japanese culture, for example, there is a general discouragement of the public display of any emotions other than happiness. So Japanese people smile a great deal on the streets and rarely show an unhappy face. The emotional expressions that a particular culture permits are known as its display rules. How much emotional expression an individual demonstrates depends, in part, on the display rules of that individual's culture. This does not mean that different cultures actually feel different emotions, but that how much they display in public is largely determined by their cultural norms. In fact, there is some evidence that, when on their own, individuals from cultures where negative emotions are frowned upon show these expressions just as often as individuals from cultures where negative emotional displays are acceptable. Emotional responses can also be modified by personal experience. We are more likely to develop phobias of the animals that posed a danger to our ancestors, like venomous snakes and spiders, but whether or not we develop a phobia at all depends on childhood experiences. An acquired response, such as a fear of dogs after being bitten, is called a conditioned emotional response. Because the conditioned response is learned, the learning can potentially be reversed by classical conditioning, whereby positive experiences are paired with a phobic animal. Having some plasticity in an evolved fear system makes sense because the dangerousness of certain types of animals will vary greatly from one part of the world to another. But classical conditioning is frequently unsuccessful as a treatment for snake and spider phobias, supporting the hypothesis that these responses are partly evolved because of the threat they pose to our ancestors. This notion of being born with a predisposition for phobias of certain animals or objects has been called preparedness theory. Humans also demonstrate plasticity of emotional response in what we find physically attractive. Here, there is massive potential for modification during development. In some cultures, scars or tattoos are considered very attractive bodily adornments, while in others, they may be seen as ugly disfigurements. what a given culture finds attractive or ugly may change rapidly over time and may even differ between different subsections of a society. In Western culture today, for example, the emotional response to tattoos has recently changed among younger members of society. So, while emotions may be universal in the sense that all cultures appear to have the same basic range of internal states and external signals, there is clearly a fair degree of malleability built into the level of response to external stimuli in our species.